Joining me now, our panel of experts on patient-centered care. We're going to talk about patients because patients are at the center of all this stuff. Christel Marchand Aprigliano is Chief Advocacy Officer for Beyond Type 1, a nonprofit organization with a mission to unite the global diabetes community and provide solutions to improving lives. Ted Okon is Executive Director of a Community Oncology Alliance that works to ensure cancer patients receive quality, affordable cancer care in their own communities. And Linda Goler Blount is the President and CEO of the Black Women's Health Imperative, a national organization focused on Black women's emotional, physical, and financial health. Welcome all. Luckily, this is like an alumni group. You should all meet each other because you've all been here before. So it's terrific, and I think we've met in different settings. But Christel, we were just hanging out yesterday together and talking a bit about diabetes, and it's just very much in my mind in terms of all the dimensions of really good people out there who want better health, and sometimes the cards are stacked against them in various ways. And we're not moving things in such a way, in my opinion, that's solving that. And so I want to ask each one of you as we get into this to talk about the communities you're trying to advocate for, and what does the rest of the healthcare community and the policy world need to change? What are the blind spots they have in understanding how to put patients first, how to get patient-directed care, and make it really matter and not just be words? Christel?
So Steve, thank you. We just celebrated 100 years since the discovery of insulin. And yet we just had a previous panelist talk about how we've got some very perverse incentives that are preventing the lower out-of-pocket cost for the list price of insulin. And so for me, when I talk about the U.S. healthcare system, it's failing. It's failing to help when it comes to patient-centered care, especially when it is about drug pricing and access. The reality is that I used to say that the system is broken. And I think that anybody would say that the system is broken, but let's be real. The system is working incredibly well for a number of entities within the supply chain because they're making a profit. And the realization that they're making the profit on the backs of patients, and especially when it comes to insulin pricing, which is a discussion that numerous congressional hearings have happened on this. We've talked about it. Patients are not part of the system. We simply pay for it with our health. And Gary talked about this in the previous session about reducing patient risk. And Dr. Harris talked about improving patient outcomes. You can't do that when the cost of a drug that keeps us alive is out of reach for many individuals. List price in itself is a lie. List price just obfuscates what I believe is perverse incentives of rebates and fees that are demanded by an entity within the supply chain, which Ted talked about this morning at a hearing. And it's demanded by PBMs to put drugs on formularies. We're not making decisions, so we can't even control the cost of the drug that we need.
Well, thank you. Ted, Christel just mentioned you were testifying before Congress today, and what did you tell those folks? I know you were talking about pharmacy benefit managers. We call them, PBMs. And what is the element of change or salutation or concern you have on PBMs?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I'll continue the theme today. I participated, I was a witness in a 2-hour forum called by the Republicans on the Oversight and Reform Committee, Ranking Member Comer. And really, it's so aggravating because I shared with the members of Congress that literally just this morning, I read an email from a practice where a gentleman was diagnosed with metastatic prostate cancer. So his bones, his lymph nodes were lighting up. And after going through a prior authorization process, the practice had the okay to give him the oral drug. But they couldn't because the PBM/insurer said, no, it has to be delivered by this specialty pharmacy. That specialty pharmacy required a whole new prior authorization. And as if this wasn't bad enough, he went through it went through a specialty, a mail order to another mail order. So he had to get his drugs in the mail each time with a prioritization. Steve, it took him 3 weeks. Imagine, you and I are guys having prostate cancer, and it holds for any cancer, but especially prostate, your everything's lighting up. You want to get that medication. And the kicker is, after 3 weeks, he finally got it from the mail order pharmacy, but the dosing was wrong. So literally, he's supposed to take 4 capsules 1 time a day at the same time. And then next, literally the PBM said, no, take 1 capsule 4 times a day. So it is dramatically different. And this is this is what we're facing. And Christel and Lynn and I just before had this little conversation, and I said, who gets disadvantaged most are people who are in the most disadvantaged position, whether they be older, whether they be on what scale on the socioeconomic scale, but these are real live Americans. And when you talk about trying to get patients treated in their own communities, it's these middlemen, especially these PBMs, that are now the same as the insurers, that, Christel said, they get in the way of patients getting treated. And it is just about a crime.
No, I can feel the passion there, Ted. And as I'm just listening to you, I was going to ask about accountability on this, but the victim who waited weeks and probably later now to get the life-saving therapies and drugs that they need, they can't wait like this. And so, I am old enough, folks, to remember how we used to talk about the Soviet Union, how we used to talk about China before it was a big. These are the kinds of things we would joke about other societies not being able to produce. And it's happening in this country. So I'm on the editorial side of this operation, I can say that. But Linda, again, when Ted was just speaking, I don't know this individual that Ted is talking about, but I do know that the experience of that individual is probably 10 times worse in some of the communities you're dealing with, who are, in disadvantage, where power, the disproportionate elements of power in the healthcare system screw you. But tell us about what you're trying to turn around.
Yeah, it's fascinating, disheartening, maddening how much of this burden we put on patients. We were semi-joking before we came on that we were supposed to be patient-centered, provide patient-centered care, and Ted said I had the wrong P. It was really profit-centered. And what happens is we put the burden on the patient to be the advocate, which means they've got to be a researcher, a pharmacist, an oncologist, all manner of specialists, a health system CEO, to know the questions to ask. That's not fair. And you're right. If we go back 35 years to the Heckler Report, where the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Margaret Heckler, said, we've got a problem. We've got disparities in health outcomes between African Americans and white Americans. Come forward now to 2021, those same disparities exist. And in fact, many are whiter now. So we've got a system that does not put patients first, that does not center patients. We've got a research process that doesn't include patients, so that we end up with therapeutics that don't work as well in certain populations. And technologies. We saw this last year with the pulse oximeter, with dexamethasone, not as effective in Black patients. We've got a pipeline that has not changed in 40 years. The percentage of Black and brown physicians hasn't changed since 1980. The percentage of NIH-funded researchers at the highest level, those that are Black and brown, still under 2%. So we have this system that's not set up for people who are low income, for people who are in rural geographies, for the Black and brown population, who from the moment they walk in a provider's office sometimes are made to feel that they're unwanted. And what happens in the instance that Christel is talking about and Ted is the patient gets blamed. Why, Mrs. Brown, haven't you been compliant? Well, because it would have taken 2 buses and a subway and 3 hours to go to get this medication, and I have a job, and I didn't want to lose my job. So we need providers, we need system leadership to understand the lived experiences of their patients and then organize the drug development, drug therapeutic management, system care availability around their lives so that they actually can participate more fully in their care. Because it's not that they don't want to, but we put up barriers that make it practically impossible at times.
Wow, Christel and Ted, I want to ask you, along those lines that Linda just talked about, one of the areas, look, I'll just be honest, folks, I lost my mother to breast cancer, right? So she fought cancer for 15 years. She was in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, is where she started out. Then she was in Dallas, Texas, then Johns Hopkins. I have to tell you, this was years ago, but the way gravity worked around her situation was different in each one of those places. The information she was given was different in each one of these places. And my mom was an incredible woman who was trusting her doctors and what she was told. I wish she hadn't. I wish she had been a warrior. I wish she had not trusted everything she had. I wish we had been more literate and gone out to do other things and become more of a fighter for her health in the system. I think we were too passive. So I'm just sharing this personal story. And so it is an interesting story. I talked to Christel yesterday about the challenge of we're expecting patients to not be passive, but to become active, empowered agents. And if they don't, they're going to get screwed. Tell me where I'm wrong, Christel.
You're not wrong. But we also need additional advocates around us. And we need bold action by elected officials, right, who are willing to champion for lower out-of-pocket costs, for better outcomes, to make sure that for our overall health, that we're able to reduce the barriers. I mean, the crazy hoops that all of us have to go through. I've had type 1 diabetes for 38 years. If I don't advocate every single day to make sure that I am taking care of myself, the blame falls on the patient. Right. And the reality is that, especially when we're looking at costs, right, and the ways to lower out-of-pocket costs for people with diabetes, we have no say. And so we have opportunities right now through policy and through some bills that are currently on the Hill that I think will help change that paradigm and help us have greater opportunities to actually have resources to help. Beyond type 1, we have getinsulin.org, which is aggregated resources. But it's a tool. It's not a solution for list prices. Right. We have to address the list prices. We have to put generics and biosimilars on the lowest tier. And that's not just for Medicare Part D, which is the bills that are out there right now. But I mean, to kind of put it on the PBMs to say, it's not a bad thing to help patients, not sacrificing the huge profit that you're currently making. Right.
Ted and Linda, I'd like to get quick thoughts from you, and then we have a question from the audience. But Ted?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna address something that Linda said. I think the good news is, if there's any good news out of COVID, is that everybody's talking about health disparities, right? I mean, even though we should have been talking about them a long time ago, and we should have been fixing them and addressing them and all of that. The bad news is there's a lot of talk, but there's not a lot of action. And I can tell you that from the COA perspective, we are jumping into action. Yes, we put out a statement. We need to do this about health disparities, and it runs everywhere, as Linda said, from the clinical trial process to the actual care in the community. Right. We have 2 pilots that are going on now. One that is about no patient left behind, Dr. Kasha Patel in South Carolina, and it is guaranteed that no patient, I mean no patient at all, will be left behind. They will be actually tested with biomarker appropriate testing and making sure that no one falls through the cracks. We have a very different pilot that looks at social determinants of health, literally from the second the patient walks in the door, they've been diagnosed with cancer, and we're trying to actually even work backwards to the primary care side in Houston, Texas, looking at the idea of let's solve this. And the last thing I want to say, Steve and Linda will have to have a conversation about this, but we've been doing a lot of research about the fall-offs in breast cancer and lung cancer and colorectal and prostate screenings due to COVID. We've specifically now zeroed in on breast cancer. and looked at screenings, mammographies, at not only pre and not post, but hopefully we're coming out of COVID, but where we are, and also looked at it along socioeconomic lines. And we actually have a manuscript.
Right.
I'm going to be a co-author on it that we hope to get published soon. And it shows some of the things that Linda just talked about in terms of disparities.
Well, thank you. Linda, I'd like to give you a snapshot here, and then we'll take a question from the audience.
I think something that's really important to note is around drugs is drugs are valued, and whether or not an insurer covers a drug depends on how that drug is valued.
Right.
But we don't often take the lived experience of the patients into consideration when coming up, well, not we, that organization that does the valuation, consider the lived experience when coming up with the value. So there can be drugs that are effective for a population that are deemed not as valuable, and so they're not available to the patient. And so to Christel's point, yes, we have to advocate, but there are some things that we just can't know. There are drugs that could help, but we'll never know about them because they'll never be covered by insurers.
Wow. Oh, let's take an audience from a question from Elaine Bleckman. Elaine?
Hi, I'm Elaine Bleckman, CEO of redkangaroo.us. My question is, what innovations are needed in health information technology, provider-facing electronic health records, consumer-facing health tech, to prepare for the biggest coming threats to public health and healthcare delivery? Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't I go to Christel? We'll take a quick snapshot from each of you. Christel?
Sure. So for us, we think that at least for the diabetes population, we have a lot of technology, but people aren't able to access it because oftentimes we're starting to see, Linda touches upon this, there's implicit bias. There is lack of the ability to access this technology. And so you can't incorporate the technology into electronic health records and have that mobility without actually addressing the fact that we're not getting to the right people and making sure that individuals with diabetes have access to the technology that they need. That's an entirely separate discussion. I'd love to come back and talk about that.
Well, we will have you back. Ted?
Yeah, I think part of the problem is there's a lot of technology out there. Some of it not only can be more user-friendly, but what I'm concerned about, there are silos. So when you basically go and you have your health record, you don't own your health record. I actually just read an article of saying that your health record shouldn't be owned by everybody who thinks they own it, including doctors and hospitals, et cetera, insurers, but it literally should be your health record. It should be transportable. So you should have access regardless if you get your employer or whoever, you switch from one insurer to another, it should be transportable. And I think that's one of the biggest problems is that the entities, and even physicians, oncologists, think, well, we own your data, whereas basically your data, your health record is your health record, and it should stay with you no matter what, just like the fact that, I switch carriers, my cell phone number is going to stay with me.
Linda, you get the last word.
I would say the innovation we need is to make technology inclusive. I published a paper 2 years ago called Overbooked and Overlooked that looked at bias that's built into the algorithms in the scheduling system of electronic health record systems. And it made Black patients, the system was double and triple booking the Black patients, so they had to wait longer. So sometimes they just left, which has implications for their care. But of course, nobody Black was involved in developing that algorithm. And we've got dozens, if not hundreds, of examples of technology that was developed by a very small group of people, that was not inclusive, that was not tested on anyone of color, that turns out not to work for them. So while we may need some innovation, we need to make what we have more inclusive so that it works for everyone.
Well, listen, I am so heartened by all the work you're doing to kind of keep people in the equation, because I think they could fall out if all of you were not doing what you're doing. But thank you so much to Christel Marchand Aprigliano, Chief Advocacy Officer for Beyond Type 1, Ted Okon, Executive Director of the Community Oncology Alliance, and Linda Goler Blount, President and CEO of the Black Women's Health Imperative. Great to talk to all of you, and I hope we can keep doing this again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.